Hello, this is Frank DeFreitas, and welcome to the first broadcast of HoloTalk, a weekly show that we're putting together to let you in on what's happening in the world of holography. We have a toll-free number now where you can call in with your questions, which we would be happy to answer here on the show. That toll-free number is, across the U.S., 1-800-458-3525, and if you're outside of the U.S., you can dial area code 610-770-0341 and leave your questions on the machine, and we'll bring them into the show. We'd like to use your voice, but it's not necessary for you to leave your name or where you're calling from, but we'd like to have your question on the show. If you'd like to use email, that's fine too. We get a lot of questions through email all the time, and we're going to start answering them on this program. The email address is holotalk@holoworld.com, so send your questions in. We're planning on having some guests with us as well as time goes on so that we can talk to some people that are actually working in the field of holography. And if you have a question for any specific field, we'll let you know what's coming up the following week, and you can send your questions in at that point. So let's get to a couple of the questions that we had come in recently. Now, this is a question that's been coming in quite a bit this time of year, and also through the years as I've had the holography studio through regular mail, and since I've had the internet Webseum of holography on the web through email. And that question is, what would you recommend for a junior high school or high school science fair project with holography and lasers? My answer to that is, and listen to this carefully, my answer to that is if you already have a small holography lab in your science department at either your junior high school or your high school, go for doing a hologram and putting that in the science fair project and writing up about it. It's an excellent choice. It's always a very high score with science fair projects across the country. However, if you do not already have the facilities to make a hologram, and by facilities, this is what I mean. You're going to need some sort of isolation system which dampens the vibration. Now, this can either be a small table that you put together yourself using the little neoprene balls that they sell now that you can rest a surface on and do the holograms. They're very easy to create. Or building a sand table, which sometimes is a real pain to put that up and have to take it down just for a science fair project. Most science departments at junior high schools and high schools that already have a laser have a very low power laser. You're not going to find a 35 milliwatt laser sitting in a high school somewhere. At least I don't think you are. I haven't seen any 35 milliwatt lasers out there. What you're going to find are half milliwatt helium neon lasers. And to be quite frank with you, I do not think that you have enough power with a half milliwatt laser to do anything that's going to impress judges at a science fair. Can you make a hologram with a half milliwatt laser? Sure, I've seen them done. They're small holograms, maybe on those little glass plates that you can buy that are 2.5 by 2.5 inches, or you cut up a larger piece of film like a 4 by 5 inch sheet into a smaller piece. But you're not going to get anything that's going to knock anybody's socks off when they come around to your table to see what it is that you've done. What I recommend people do is if you have a laser already in your science department and you want to do a project, unless you've got the facilities to make a hologram, stay away from holography. Go instead to doing a specific project using just the laser, which is much easier, and you can use a half milliwatt laser. Here are some of the things that I recommend. Number one, this is a quite popular one, and this answers the question, this would be the question of your science fair project. Does laser light change the size or shape of an object? And here's what we normally do. We take an object, a simple object like a wooden block or something else that can be measured quite easily, and we illuminate that object with white light, and the shadow gets cast onto graph paper. We then mark on that graph paper the size of the shadow that the object makes. Then we take the helium neon laser and we pass that beam through a lens, and we illuminate the object one more time, this time using the laser light. We keep our graph paper in the same spot so that we're not changing anything with the setup except for the light source itself. And then once that object is illuminated with the laser light and is casting a shadow onto the graph paper, then we take our measurement again. We see Does laser light change the size or shape of an object? And then you have to go on to give your reasons why. Is it really because it's a different light source than the white light source that we used? Or does the lens have anything to do with it? The fact that we're taking that unspread beam and spreading it out and then casting the shadow with the diverging beam. This is a very popular science fair project, and there's a number of other ones too. For instance, lasers are being used in industry and construction, so you may be able to show a pipe. You can take a laser beam and send it through a pipe and show if the pipe is actually bent in any areas and things of that nature from the laser beam passing through on the other side. So there's a number of things that you can do that you already have right in your science department, and the only additional items you would need, especially for the first item that I mentioned, would be a diverging lens, which would take the laser beam and spread it out. So that's my answer on that question. If you've got a science fair project coming up, in a nutshell, if you have equipment all ready to do holography, which is a little bit of an isolation system, you're going to have lenses. And these lenses should be in pretty good shape. This can't be the same type of lens that's being passed around to 40 kids in a class and they've got their fingerprints all over it and things of that nature. These need to be pretty good lenses to do a good hologram. You're going to need front surface mirrors. You can't use mirrors that have the silver on the back because you're going to get a very strong interference pattern. Once that beam is reflected off that mirror and then passed through a lens, you're going to notice a lot of fringes. You have to have a front surface mirror, and once again, it should be in very good shape. So if you don't already have these items, my suggestion to you would be just go with the laser that you have and do a simple project answering a few questions about laser light itself. Okay, let's move on to our next question. By the way, if you have a question that you'd like to send into the show, we'd love to put it on the air. The toll-free number across the U.S. is 1-800-458-3525. Leave your question on the answering machine. You don't need to leave your name or the area that you're calling from. Just leave your question. We'd love to hear your voice on the show. You can also send email to holotalk@holoworld.com. We got a question, and this is a common question as well, just like the first one. How much power do I need in a laser to make a hologram? And that's a good question. Number one, power equals dollars. How much money do you have to spend? That would have to be the first thing that I would have to ask to you. Half milliwatt laser, I would try and stay away from it if possible because, number one, you will be able to do very small holograms. I don't know if you'd be able to move into a split beam setup, but you'd be able to make single beam holograms with the half milliwatt, but you're going to be very small holograms. And there's no room for growth. What if you find out that you really like holography and you'd like to stick with it? What are you going to do? You can't move up to bigger holograms because you don't have the power to do it. When I first got started in holography, I made the initial investment to buy a 5 milliwatt laser, and I made sure that it was polarized too. That's very important. Although you can do holograms without a polarized laser, you don't need one to be polarized to make holograms. But if you have a polarized beam, you're going to find out that you're going to save a lot of power as that beam travels through your optical system. You'll find out that with a polarized laser, the beam will travel through the lens with less reflection coming off of that substrate than if you were to have a non-polarized laser. So why spend the money for a 5 milliwatt unpolarized laser when you're going to be losing a lot of that power as it travels around the table and going through different lenses? So get yourself a 5 milliwatt laser. Make sure that it's polarized. I have done in the past, back in the mid-'80s, I did multiple color holograms, 4x5-inch glass plate holograms using a 5 milliwatt laser, utilizing the triethanolamine technique, which is pre-swelling the plate, pre-swelling the emulsion actually before you do the exposure for each of the individual colors. So not only will you be able to start out and learn holography and do your very simple holograms with a 5 milliwatt laser, but as time goes on and you want a little bit more of a challenge in your holographic journey, a 5 milliwatt laser is going to give you enough room for growth that you can start moving into some very interesting projects with holography. So go with the 5 milliwatt if you can. If you can't, I know there are a number of different 3 milliwatts out there. It might be a nice middle of the road. But if I were you, I would stay away from the half milliwatt lasers. They're just not worth the money that you're going to put out. You're going to be disappointed after a while when you just can't move on. Okay, let's move on to our third question. This is an interesting question. I get this in email every so often. I don't get it a lot, but every so often. And that question is, I need information on holograms that float in space. Now, I'm not quite sure what the person is asking about here, but my guess is that they're asking about holographic images that just sort of like hang in space and float in front of you. And unless I haven't seen it, I do not know of any holographic images that just sort of like hover in space. I know there's a number of different techniques that can be used. There are lasers that can draw three-dimensional images inside of crystals. There are also ways of projecting images out in space using conventional optics such as collimating mirrors. And this is the type of technique that's used down in the haunted house that everyone always comes up to me and asks me, oh, I saw the holographic faces in the haunted house ride down in Disney World in Florida. I've not been there myself. I do not know firsthand what this looks like when people are seeing it, but they're thinking that it's a hologram. From my research looking into this, I have found out that Disney uses traditional optical techniques to do that, and it's either a slide or some sort of transparency or a moving image such as a videotape or film that's reflected off a collimating mirror. Now, what a collimating mirror does is it will take that light and it will focus it out in space. But keep in mind that this is not a three-dimensional image just because it's floating in space. If you were to stop in your tracks and really examine this image, you'd find out that even though it's hovering there in front of you, and you could probably reach out with your hand and pass your hand through it, the actual image itself is flat. It's not three-dimensional. If it were someone's face, the nose would not be closer to you than one of the ears. It would all be on the same plane. And just because it's floating in space does not necessarily make it a hologram. Myself, I have never seen a holographic image that was just hovering in space. Traditionally, you need either a holographic plate to store the information on with a light-sensitive emulsion which contains the fringe patterns, or you need the film, which does the same thing. Now, with the stereograms, there's 180-degree stereograms and there's 360-degree stereograms. You've seen these. They're fairly popular. I like them quite a bit. They're originally shot on motion picture film, and as the cylinder turns, it's usually on a little motor, and it has a light at the base that comes up and illuminates the inside of the hologram, and the image is focused to the center of that cylinder, which makes it appear to float in space in between the in between the walls of the cylinder as that cylinder rotates. That's probably as close as you're going to get to seeing an image actually hover in space. And of course, that's hovering inside a device, not outside in thin air. So my answer to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can also call in and correct me anytime that you want to or send an email, that's fine. I do not know of any holograms that you can sit down and just see that object or person or whatever the hologram's made of just hover in space in front of you, unless there's something to do with a film or plate that has that holographic information on, and there's a light that's shining on that hologram that's taking the light and actually projecting it out. So I don't know what information to give you on holograms that float in space, but I would have a tendency to tell you to look into other techniques. It's not a holographic technique at all. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this first broadcast of HoloTalk. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you have any questions regarding lasers and or holograms that you'd like to see covered here and answered on HoloTalk, I'd like to remind you once again, we do have a toll-free number across the U.S. That number is 1-800-458-3525. You can leave your message on the answering machine that will take your call. And you do not need to leave your name or the area that you're calling from, but we would really like to use your voice actually asking the question on the air with upcoming shows. If you prefer, you can also use email. You can send your questions to holotalk@holoworld.com, and we will get your questions on the air that way as well. I'd also like to remind you that we are planning on having guests on the show. which we will do a short interview with people who are working in the field of holography. And please tune in for future shows to see what's coming up as far as guests are concerned. So this is Frank DeFreitas for HoloTalk. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to having you listen to the show again next week here at the Internet Webseum of Holography. Good night.